Yeah, you're going to get sick of me saying risk-based approach, but I've just said it now. Is it the third time? I think we should have a shot, Jeremy, every time I
I've got a
say
tally.
this.
I've got a tally code. So. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Man in the Middle podcast. I'm your host, Jeremy Maloli. This is an Ithaca Media podcast. And today we're joined by Nikki Peever, who's the Director of Cybersecurity at the Council of Australasian University Directors of Information Technology. Bit of a mouthful, but the acronym is CAUDIT. And what her work is to ensure that institutions receive support, resources, and guidance needed to stay secure and resilient in a dynamic digital landscape. So one of the areas we're sort of going to cover on today's episode is based on a talk that Nikki has at the upcoming CyberCon, and it's around the management of spend and resources without having to compromise on security. So with that being said, I want to welcome you to the show, Nikki. Thanks for coming on board.
Thanks for having me, Jeremy.
My pleasure. And just sort of to kick things off, I usually like to ask my guests around kind of their origin of how they got into this space of cybersecurity, but more broadly just technology. So sort of like to start there with you, Nikki. How did you get into technology and then leading into the world of cybersecurity specifically?
Yeah, it's very interesting. Cyber is not a linear progression for most of us. You know, you've got people, as you said, technology, often, networking or law enforcement, but more often now, we're seeing people coming from business, lawyers, a range of different areas. So my journey in grade 12, there was an internship to do an IT sort of program during that final year. And I took that on because when I was in grade 12, back in the day, Jeremy, there weren't many females in IT. And I guess I was a bit defiant, right? I thought, don't tell me what I can't do. So I decided to join that. And I was one of, the few girls then in an IT degree. I think I was one of three for that whole cohort in that year. And from there, I started on just a service desk, as most people do, for a hosting provider, which really interesting space to be because you have exposure to a range of different areas on a service desk, especially when, it's a more hands-on type of support desk. And from there, I found myself in federal government, service desk, then manager, and eventually became an auditor, which fabulous role, going into different companies and assessing their ISMSs. And I've just always done, a lot of continual study. So everything's interesting to me. I've done IT, psychology, law. I just really fascinated, loved learning, and ultimately found myself in my favorite job in the world, CAUDIT, looking after the cybersecurity program. And it's really brought together all these different areas that I've studied over the past couple of decades and all these different roles. And it's just really neatly fit into this cyber program, which I love.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Like, it's interesting that, as you progress in the career of cybersecurity, that you've noticed that there is so many different facets to it. And do you think that's why, like you said, there isn't a linear progression for people? There's just so many different, I suppose, entry points, and then different I guess areas to specialize in, that you sort of using different skill sets and using different ways of thinking. Do you think that's why it attracts so many different types of people?
Absolutely. It's very broad. You could be very hands-on technical, responding to incidents or looking at supply risk or the legal ramifications. It's quite a broad field. Like, 15 years ago, people say, I work in IT, and you just go, oh, computers. But really, you've got development. Again, you've got networking. You've got such a diverse area. And I know cyber used to be one of those tack-on things. When I worked for Attorney General's Department, we had one information security advisor was the role, one person looking after 1,000 people. And I remember he used to say he had the best job. All he had to do was say no to everyone, because people didn't understand risk back then. Like, they didn't really understand what cyber was. And it wasn't really well established till probably, I would say, about 10 years ago. That's going to probably change because you've got actual cyber degrees now and cyber programs that you can study, and people will graduate high school, go into cyber programs, and then, come in with the intention of being a cybersecurity person, whatever that looks like for them, technical governance, whatever that is.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay. Look, I want to get into one of the reasons we invited you on today, which was around your upcoming talk, which we alluded to, and it's actually titled, managing spend without compromising on security. So just sort of starting more broadly, could you like touch on what that topic entails and a little bit about what you will be speaking on in that area?
Yeah, absolutely. So, a lot of people are doing it tough financially. I'm in the higher education sector and there's been visa caps and things like that, but it's not the only sector that's having trouble kind of managing cyber budgets and making sure they've got the controls in place. So the purpose of this session was just to give people some ideas around methods they can use to make sure that they've got their controls covered without maybe overdoing their budgets. So many benefits to this, right? Like you're reducing your third party risk. If you uplift your maturity, you're reducing that surface level exposure and you want to make better use of your human resources. So some of the things I'm going to speak about in that session are collective purchasing and some benefits of collective buys, tooling consolidation. Benchmarking is one thing that I'll speak to in quite a bit of detail. So I think it's really important to understand where you sit, but compare yourself, to similar organisations. If you're a family-owned doctor practice, you can't compare yourself to the Commonwealth Bank of Australia, for example, right? So one thing that I always think is quite important is to set some realistic goals and milestones. You can't do everything today. You want to, but you can't. It's a journey. It's maybe a 3-year program. And so you need to be really strategic, and you can't do that if you don't have that data as a starting point for you. So benchmarking is something that I'll kick off the session with and speak to a little bit about that.
Great. Well, like just on benchmarking there, like what are we talking around as far as that? Like, is it, you used the example of like comparing, to Commonwealth Bank versus say like a family doctor practice. Like, is it size? Is it the way things are structured? Could you sort of touch on some of the areas you're looking at when it comes to benchmarking?
Yeah, 100%. So I run benchmarking for the higher education sector. We look at sort of the size of the team, so the size of the cyber teams and what type of roles you might have in that cyber team. We look at sort of that CISO role and where they might sit across the organisation, who their reporting lines are to. We look at obviously spend and what percentage of your IT investment you're putting on your cyber program. Industry says 20% is about right. I think that's the latest Gartner figure. And, we see it down as low as 5%. After an incident, you see people bump that up to about 30%, right? So the best way to get some money is often to have an incident, unfortunately. But so some of that stuff's interesting. How many standards you're trying to sort of meet and your governance area. And then it may also be different for the sector, right? So, your banking sector might have some different benchmarking things that you might need in the health sector, for example. So what you're trying to find with this benchmarking is a similar comparative, data. And a lot of that is public if you go looking. You may also just find that by networking, right? Like meeting a CISO that's in a similar job to you and having them as an ally and understanding what they're doing and making sure that you're then setting a realistic program for yourself.
Yeah, okay. And then does it also include, like, as one of the things I wanted to ask around was like how you're sort of providing the most return on investment and like most value from like the activities you're doing there. Are there certain metrics you're looking for when you're looking to see an indication of how effective a program like this is based on those? Like, is that sort of part and parcel of benchmarking, or are we talking about something different beyond that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you need to make sure your priorities are risk aligned to your business. So you need to understand the scope of your organization and take a risk based approach then to that. Cyber is not just this one off project that, you start today and you're going to finish it in December. This is a continual uplift program. So as I mentioned, you normally might do 2 to 3 year type of program runs. I would always say you choose a standard, right? It doesn't matter what one, NIST, Essential 8, ISO, just choose something and start there. It's a really good place to start, and you can look at your controls and measure yourself against those, whether you then go to be certified or not, but you can look at those controls and assess yourself. And then over time, you can assess your progress across sort of whatever standard you've chosen. And if you have nothing right now, that's a great place to start, just some type of sort of compliance program. Once you mature, you can then really be specific and identify what your major risks are, and you may then want to get into a massive program of segmentation or whatever that looks like as your next step. But your first step, you've got to just choose something and measure your controls and make sure you're improving that.
Yeah, excellent. Okay. And when it comes to, I suppose, like choosing like what you prioritize, like, and also, part of that is you mentioned not compromising on certain key areas. Could you talk around how you do find that balance? Like, in what areas do you want to identify that you can't compromise, and ones that you can, and so forth, and to what degree you can compromise in certain areas as well?
Yeah, you're going to get sick of me saying risk-based approach, but I've just said it now. Is it the third time? I think we should have a shot, Jeremy, every time I
I've
say
got a
this.
tally. I've got a tally code. So
Yeah, you're the tally guide. Awesome. So, I mean, you do need to understand the risks of your actual organization. Are you storing a lot of PII? Is that your main type of thing that you're worried about in that sense? Do you have a disgruntled workforce? Are you worried potentially about insider theft or something like that? So you need to kind of really understand the scope of your organization and take a risk-based approach there. Saying that, it's normally up to the board or the exec, right, to make those spend decisions. So the first thing you need to do is make sure you're well versed in board speak. You need to talk to the exec. Can you articulate the value for money? If you don't have MFA, can you articulate what that's going to do? Really difficult to say, it's going to save us 20 million bucks if we're compromised. That's what we'll be paying. Very difficult to kind of articulate that. And above all else, I would say you need to practice your response. The likelihood of being breached is there, right? You could have every control in place and something happens that you didn't foresee. Some new sort of threat comes up overnight and you're not prepared for it. So above all else, you need to put some money into that response and practice that, detect and respond and contain that quickly. And, if nothing else, make sure you get some tabletops in place. The government actually offers some free tabletop activities through the National Office of Cybersecurity. So I would jump on those if you're really, really stuck for resources, and make sure that you're ready, because you don't want that first incident to happen and you have no preparation. You're going to make a ton of mistakes, which is just going to make it very much worse than it could have been.
Yeah, so it sounds like, I mean, even just what you said there, Nikki, and some of the things you said earlier, like, it sounds like, being able to take advantage of not just the funding sources you can have, but like resources that go beyond that. So, like you said, it's, are there certain resources that the government provide free, or are you able to collaborate with another CISO in a similar sector? Like, is that like, is there not enough emphasis placed on that when it comes to these types of programs?
Absolutely. I would say those type of things are some of the more innovative approaches I've seen people take, and they're really, pay off. So collective purchasing is one thing I'll speak about in the session at ASA. What we've done across the sector is got together with the Canadian universities. So there's about 220 Canadian, public and private universities. And then in Australia and New Zealand, we've got about 33 of those universities together, and we're all sharing a cloud third-party risk program. So instead of paying, 6 figures plus each, we're paying $5,000, right? So it's huge savings for everyone across the board. Everyone's saving money, but also we're sharing the workload, right? So we're not all doing the same vendor assessment or logging the same thing. It's done in the system for all of us together. We've got the lovely folk at Toronto Metropolitan University running some analytics and sort of benchmarking within that platform for us. So it's just a phenomenal bulk buy. And CAUDIT do that across the board. We have incident response hours that reduce the price because we're buying, a bulk purchase. So that would be one of the, innovative things that you can do if you can band with fellow CISOs in your sector, or even through the government. The Queensland government, for example, offers some really similar programs and similar collective buying things that are just going to save a bunch of money, but also that resource cost. You can't undermine how crucial it is to free your people up to do more interesting things. A couple of other things I've seen. One Australian university has partnered with a UK university to do like follow the sun in EDR sort of detection. So they're, instead of doing neither of them could afford sort of their own SOC service or anything like that. They're quite small. So they've got basically someone monitoring their incidents overnight, and then they do the favor the next day. So I think that's quite innovative and sort of frees both of those universities up to do more interesting things. And then the last thing that you just mentioned as well, the networking, sort of making an ally or friend, someone who's in a similar organization. The amount of times I hear at events, I just had a conversation with someone that saved me $15,000, right? Because I see that they're doing this when I've done it this way. And, my $800 ticket for this event has paid itself off with that huge savings. So I just can't, undersell the value of that networking aspect.
Yeah, that's great. Like, and just like on those sorts of, like a couple of the examples you gave there, like what's, I guess, some actionable things you can do? I suppose the last element, the networking one, I mean, the obvious thing that comes to me is taking part in conferences where there's, high volume of people that you can speak to and meet in all sorts of different areas. Like, what are some other things do you think could be actionable?
The networking's great. And, I'm an introvert and there's a lot of introverts around, and I love to go to networking events and just hang out with the people I already know, right? I don't like to go put myself out there, talk to new people, but I think you need to. Like, you have to kind of be brave and go and just introduce yourself to people. I think being open and transparent as well with them, talking, having good conversations, hearing just different ideas. If you don't get the value, you may actually be helping someone else. So I think there's that sort of intrinsic motivation there. Like, you can actually be, maybe what you're doing is actually stellar, and by telling someone else, they've learned something from you. So I think, that networking and collaboration is phenomenal. We spoke about some of the government, innovations in this area. The government have trusted information sharing networks for critical infrastructure sectors. So if you're not already a part of your own network, if that's health, mining, gas, whatever, all of the critical infrastructure sectors are covered, I would make sure, you find an opportunity to join that. Feel free to reach out to me, LinkedIn if you're unsure, but you could type that into a browser and just find the link there through the Department of Home Affairs. So as I said, it's existing. You don't need to do anything. You join, you can come to the meetings, and you can immediately network and collaborate with people within your sector who have similar interests.
Yeah, great. Like, and you've mentioned a couple of things there, and make sure we've got like links to that in the description, bio, etc., things like that. And we're kind of going in the direction of the leadership angle, which is some of the other things I wanted to ask you around, Nikki, because I know that you have a role in the strategic cybersecurity leadership development in the community. I wanted to start by asking, like, what are some primary qualities or approaches that leaders in the field need to prioritize today?
Yeah, that's a really great question. In cyber, in particularly, burnout's quite an issue. So I think just that human aspect of it. I mentioned, having open and honest conversations, but also listening to your staff, being open to their new ideas, and even just, being there for them to have a vent to if they need it, and really understanding that human side of your staff. A lot of people, as I mentioned earlier, they come into cyber from tech backgrounds where maybe that wasn't as much of a priority. If you're working with computers all day, you're maybe not out there talking to staff all day. And so it is quite a different role, a leadership role compared to maybe a technical management type of role. I think it's also very important, not to ever be the smartest person in the room, and not to ever think you know it all about cyber, because you can't possibly. You have to be able to trust your staff. You have to hire the right people, and then trust them to do their job, and then be there for them when they need it. I think that's probably the most crucial area for leaders today, to sort of really help this burnout and cyber fatigue that a lot of people are facing.
Yeah, so like building upon like a more empathetic approach and like a people focused approach to when it comes to being in charge of a team and being able to make sure that they're not being burnt out, stressed out, and so forth. So like building upon that skill set sounds like is probably the most important area, right?
100%. And I guess also for the leaders looking after themselves, a CISO average turnover is, I think, it was 2 years, and it's reduced now to about 18 months. And that's a lot of that is due to burnout in that particular role. So I think also making sure your own well-being is up there as well, and you're looking after yourself. It's a tough role, really tough gig. I don't know anyone, why would you want to do it when it's, it's a long day, you're often bear the brunt of any problems, and your role's at risk if you're breached, right? Who's going to take the fall for that? So it is a really tough gig. And so you need to make sure that you're very resilient and you're able to put yourself first. If something does go wrong, you're ready to take a break if you need to, and you trust your staff to be able to pick up anything that needs to happen.
Yeah, great. Well, just talking on cyber security resilience, because I know CAUDIT, like as a organisation, there's an emphasis on the technological, but also the leadership best practices. So my question is, like, how do you sort of balance those two different facets of it when it comes to like the investment for people in cybersecurity resilience?
Yeah, so you mean balancing kind of like tech spend versus people spend type of, is that sort of what you're saying around?
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So Jason, I'm co-presenting with Jason at ACE. So he's going to talk a little bit about automation and consolidating tooling. So I won't go too much into that aspect. If anyone listening is going to be at ACE, make sure you come check out the show. Jason's got a lot of cool stuff to share around those two areas. As I mentioned, though, people first and foremost, and what you really want to make sure is that the tech complements the people. Often you can put in a new tool set and it's just resource intensive to learn. Like, that in itself is leading to burnout. You need to really make sure you're making better use of your human resources. Their work has to be interesting and fulfilling, not fatiguing because you bought this new shiny tool and, you want to put it in, but it's such a process to implement that you're taking people away from the actual interesting work that they're doing.
Yeah, okay, no, that's really great advice. And yeah, like I said, I advise that people go check out that talk when they're there in person.
Sure.
Sort of going a bit around your background and experience again, Nikki, because like I know you've been in a lot of diverse initiatives, like from operational support to governance and compliance. I want to ask, like, is there a particular project for you that stands out in your mind that has, been impactful or shaped the way that you approach cybersecurity more generally, and especially leading to your role at CAUDIT?
Yeah, it's a great question. I just feel I've been so lucky. All of my roles have been interesting. Every project's been incredible. At Australian Government Solicitor, every role was just my team were just incredible. And then we worked on so many projects that were really fun. And cyber, as I mentioned, we had an advisor there. So it wasn't really ever a consideration of projects back then. It was just something like an add-on, but it was something that we always kept in mind around, how secure is this? What policies do we have in place? But I shudder to think, how little we kind of put cyber in our minds as we were rolling out huge projects. And then I guess when I was auditing, some of those projects were incredible, watching, really small businesses like a builder, right, with 3 staff, and they've taken on getting ISO certified purely because they're sick of supplier checklists, right? And so if you're ISO certified, you can skip that supplier checklist and just say, here's my certification. So purely, just a selfish reason, I guess, to undertake it. But then I love watching them find their passion for it and how invested they are. And to the point, you're in your stage 2 and you tell them you've passed and they're popping like a champagne bottle and just, having a party. And it's just so wholesome to see that and see, someone who hardly uses a computer, a builder, just be so engaged in sort of the process. And it's always a risk, you certify them and then you come back for the surveillance, but then watching they've actually taken on the program, they've made improvements, those type of things, just exciting to see. So there are a few things that have jumped out to me over my career. Probably the last thing, like CAUDIT, as I mentioned, is the most amazing job in the world. My job, the sector's incredible, the community's amazing. And so it's not sort of one project in itself, it's just sort of every day I've got CISOs helping each other, the community members reaching out, someone has an incident and then another CISO emails, can I help you? Just that type of collaboration is so refreshing to see. where 10 years ago cyber, was a secret. No one wanted to kind of share their programs. And here you've got CISO sharing their whole strategies with each other. Like, it's just magnificent to see.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, because like one thing I've noticed from like a community point of view is that emphasis on community and collaboration, and that being like a transparency amongst different people in the industry, because there is that recognition that it is a collective effort. Like, do you think that it feels like it didn't happen by accident? Like, why do you think it is that way?
I think just because you can't do it alone, right? Like, it is too big
Yeah.
of a job to do on your own. If you're not sharing threat intel with each other, if someone's breached, it's super unfortunate, right? But the best thing they can do is share what happened, their IOCs. They can share details so others can then put mechanisms in place. Because more often than not, someone else in the similar industry or similar sector is going to be attacked by that same method. So it's important to know, there is a criminal doing this right now. Make sure you've got these mitigations in place. And I just think it's the only way. Like they say, this is a war, right? A digital war. And we need to band together and support each other, leave no one behind in this process.
Yeah, great. Yeah, like I sort of agree with that sentiment there. Going back to sort of, I guess, like the leadership roles in cybersecurity, like for those who are starting out in those leadership roles, like within any given sector, who might have limited budgets that we mentioned, what's some like basic advice that you'd give to them when it comes to like maximizing the impact that they have with whatever budget they have available to them?
Yeah, if they're starting fresh, the first thing I guess you've got to do is, as I mentioned before, understand your scope of your organization and choose a standard and measure yourself against that. You need to really understand your most critical assets across that organization, especially if it's sort of a new sector you haven't dealt with before, or a new company. You may not quite understand the business as much as you think. So you need to get out there and talk to people across the business. There's probably a bunch of things happening that weren't on your radar, and you need to make sure that those critical assets and information are well protected. You've got the policies in place there. I mentioned before as well, your response. So, I'd make sure you're running a tabletop within that first kind of 6 months. So you just have a measure of how equipped the organization is to respond to something. I think that's really important, and just a really nice place to start with. So measuring your controls, understanding the business, and understanding how ready you are for a response.
Yeah, okay. And then also, like, originally selecting the standard, is there any like sort of bias towards one or another if you're sort of starting from scratch, or is it kind of neither here nor there?
I just choose what you're comfortable with to start with. I think ultimately you'd want to probably go to something like NIST, like something that's a bit more, or ISO, that's, a bit more complete. But, if Essential 8, you're comfortable with it, start there. Essential 8's kind of like it's the ACSC's response to incidents that they had seen. So it's maybe not as complete as some of the other programs, but it's what they saw happening across the nation, and, the main threats that they had identified as part of sort of the reporting that they'd received, which it may not be examples of all the incidents across Australia, but just who's reporting it. But whatever you're comfortable with, start there. If the organisation already has something in place, and they're really attached to it, you also need to look at compliance requirements. So you may have obligations under, GDPR, for example, or under certain jurisdictions. So I also just obviously make sure I'm not telling you to avoid your compliance needs, but there may be state-based privacy requirements or data retention and things like that. So just make sure you're also meeting those requirements as appropriate.
Yeah. Okay. Great. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Look, we are sort of unfortunately coming to the end of this conversation. Nikki, I know it's very upsetting. But sort of just like I kind of want like the note I want to finish off on, like just based on what those who have listened to this conversation, what if there was one thing you'd want them to take away from some of the areas we've talked about? What might that be in in the spirit of building a better cybersecurity future for all.
Yeah,
Sounds
great
kind of
question.
lofty, doesn't it? But
It does, right? It's very visionary, Jeremy. I love the community approach. So look for friends and allies, right? And don't be shy about it. Be bold. Make that first move and to introduce yourself to someone at an event or after a webinar or something. Don't be shy. Looking for comparative data, comparing yourself to something similar. If you're comparing yourself to something that's way out of reach, right, you're only going to be disheartened. So really comparing yourself like for like. I didn't speak a lot about this in the session, but don't buy every new and shiny thing. Apologies if there's any sort of vendors listening to this podcast, but there's opportunities in probably what tooling you already have. So look for those as well. One example is like Microsoft have an inbuilt sort of phishing simulation you can run. You maybe don't need to go buy one of those if you've already invested in that Microsoft one and it's good enough for what you need, right? So look at what you've got and find out what the capabilities already are. And then I guess also that risk-based approach, I'll have to say, is that the sixth time I think now I'm mentioning risk-based approach, but, look at your priorities, look at your risk appetite, understand your business and take that risk-based approach to what you're implementing. You can't do it all at once. So you need a multi-year plan and make sure it's aligned to those risks.
Fantastic. And an excellent note to finish the conversation on. Nikki, thank you so much for coming on. But before we close off, how can we find out more about yourself and more about the work that CAUDIT does as well in this space?
Yeah, so anyone who's working in the higher education sector, more than welcome to join our communities of practice. We've got communities for cyber, business analysts, procurement, any kind of communities within that CIO, CDO type of position. That's sort of who we support across the higher education sector. So jump on our website, join our communities if you're in the sector. Welcome to connect on LinkedIn, or you probably see me running around a conference somewhere. Come up and say hi, don't be shy.
Fantastic. And just out of curiosity, is the topic that we were talking today, is that the only talk you have at CyberCon, or do you have others planned?
No, that's the only one I'm doing at CyberCon this year. Yeah, so that's through the Australian Computer and Law Society. We run a stream every year at CyberCon. So again, another great society to be part of, and jump online if you're interested in computers and law, two very fascinating topics.
Absolutely. Yeah, great. And once again, Nick, I really appreciate you coming on board. I enjoyed the conversation and hope that we can have future ones to talk about new topics.
Anytime. Thanks, Jeremy.